I want to start with a date. April 5th, 1909. That morning, a newspaper in Phoenix, Arizona ran a front page story, not buried in the back, not a footnote. Front page, above the fold. The headline read, and I want to be precise about this: Explorations in Grand Canyon. Mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light. The article described a man named G.E. Kincaid, an explorer who had spent months alone on the Colorado, navigating its length in a small wooden boat from Green River, Wyoming, all the way south to Yuma. Picture that. A single man, a wooden hull, oars against current, hundreds of miles of canyon wall rising on either side, like the walls of a cathedral that never ends. According to the article, somewhere along that journey, Kincaid looked up. 2,000 feet above the waterline, on the eastern wall, he noticed stains in the sedimentary formation, discoloration that did not match the surrounding rock. And when he climbed, which the article says he did with great difficulty, he found a shelf. And behind that shelf, hidden from view from the river below, was a mouth, a cave, not a small crack in sandstone, a network. Passageways radiating outward from a central chamber like the spokes of a wheel, hewn from solid rock, filled with artifacts the article claimed were of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt, tracing back to Ramses. The article named a professor from the Smithsonian Institution as the lead archaeologist, a man called S.A. Jordan. It described what they found inside with a specificity that still catches me off guard. Copper tools, stone tablets covered in hieroglyphics, urns marked with fine designs, a shrine carved from stone with an idol seated in lotus position, and rows of mummified remains, all male, each on a separate rock-hewn shelf, copper cups and broken swords at their heads. The article estimated that 50,000 people could have lived comfortably inside that cave system. 50,000. And then the story disappeared. No follow-up, no retraction, no correction. Just silence. The record goes quiet. This is the beginning of something I have been researching for a long time. What follows is the first piece, and I want to be upfront with you about something before we go any further. For most of my life, I accepted the standard explanation. A newspaper hoax, a slow news day, an April Fool's joke published 4 days late. It is tidy. It is clean. No, not clean. Curated. Because the more I looked at the actual evidence, the harder it became to hold on to that comfort. Not because of what the article claims, but because of what happened after. Because of the institutional silence that followed. Because of what you are still not allowed to do in certain parts of the Grand Canyon today, in the year 2026. So this is not a video about ancient Egyptians in Arizona. This is a video about a newspaper article that exists, an institution that denies it, and a canyon that remains, in very specific places, sealed. Let me walk through what we actually know. And I mean know. Not suspect, not believe, not imagine. Know. The Arizona Gazette was a real newspaper operating in Phoenix. Not a tabloid, not some fringe pamphlet. It published daily. It covered local affairs, territorial politics, and national news. On March 12, 1909, the Gazette ran a shorter piece mentioning Kincaid's river journey and noting archaeological discoveries of interest. That was the first mention. Then 24 days later, the longer article appeared. Front page, multiple columns, thousands of words. Naming institutions, naming individuals, describing precise locations and specific artifacts with a level of detail that goes far beyond casual fabrication. Now here is what the official record states. The Smithsonian Institution has said that its Department of Anthropology searched its files without finding any mention of a Professor Jordan of G.E. Kincaid or of a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. They also pointed out that the article referred to the Smithsonian Institute using the wrong word. The correct name is the Smithsonian Institution, not Institute. Institution. They called this a tell, and maybe it is. I want to be fair about that. a newspaper misspelling the name of the institution it is quoting. That is not a great sign. But here is where my comfort with the hoax explanation started to erode. I have read newspaper hoaxes from this era. They are vague. They gesture at wonders without giving you coordinates. They invoke unnamed sources and unspecified locations. This article gives you measurements. It gives you materials. It describes the precise location, 42 miles upstream from El Tovar Crystal Canyon, 2,000 feet above the waterline. Steps cut in the rock, copper hooks on ledges suggesting ladders, a gray metal resembling platinum, granaries made of a very hard cement, stone tablets with engravings. That matched no known system. That is not what a casual hoax looks like. The specificity of it gnaws at me. That is either a remarkably gifted fiction writer with unusual knowledge of geology and Near Eastern archaeology, or it is something else. And the something else is what I cannot stop sitting with. I am not saying this is proof of anything. I am saying it is a question that does not have a satisfying answer. Stay with the timeline, because the timeline is where the pattern lives. The article names the Smithsonian. It names specific people. It describes what the Gazette called not only the oldest archaeological discovery in the United States, but one of the most valuable in the world. And then, nothing. No newspaper picked it up. No wire service carried it. No academic journal referenced it. The Coconino Sun reprinted a brief mention on April 16th, and that was the end of it. The end. For decades, the story sat in crumbling microfilm, untouched, unread, like a letter someone mailed that never arrived. Grand Canyon historian Don Lago connected the article to a tradition of tall tales in Western newspapers, sometimes called Mulhattan stories, and I respect that scholarship. I have read it carefully, but the silence itself is an anomaly, because the Smithsonian did not issue a denial in 1909, or 1920, or 1950. They did not address the article at all, for nearly a century. The denials came much later, in written responses to public inquiries that began in the Internet age. I am presenting this as a question, not a conclusion. But there is a difference between a story being ignored because it is false, and a story being ignored because someone preferred that it stay ignored. One is indifference. The other is a choice. The documentation is thin, and that thinness itself is worth studying. What do you think they found? I am asking sincerely. Either this is the most elaborate newspaper hoax of 1909, or there is a gap in the archive that has never been adequately explained. If you are finding this worth your time, consider subscribing. This series goes places that most channels will not touch. Having you along for the investigation means everything. Now, back to the canyon. I need to introduce a detail that shifted something for me. A geologist named Clarence Edward Dutton. In 1882, Dutton published a monograph through the United States Geological Survey called Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District. The National Park Service calls him the Grand Canyon's poet-geologist. He saw the canyon not just as rock and erosion, but as architecture, as something built. Dutton introduced a naming convention for the canyon's buttes and mesas that drew from world mythology: Hindu, Egyptian, Norse, Greek, Arthurian. He believed the canyon was so monumental that ordinary American place names could not hold the weight of what he was seeing. It needed names from the deepest wells of human civilization. And so, when you open a topographic map of the Grand Canyon today, you will find Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, Tower of Set, Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Buddha Temple, Shiva Temple, all official, all approved by the United States Board on Geographic Names, most of them between 1902 and 1908. Let me say that again. These names were made official between 1902 and 1908. The Kincaid article describing Egyptian artifacts inside the Grand Canyon was published in 1909. The standard explanation is reasonable. Dutton named formations after Egyptian deities because he admired their grandeur. The article came later and took advantage of the pre-existing names to build a plausible fiction. Correlation, not causation. His own associate Frederick Dellenbaugh actually objected at the time. He said, and this is documented by the National Park Service itself, "I object violently to Oriental and Egyptian nomenclature." Violently, not casually, not politely, violently. Which tells you that even then, the naming felt like something more than whimsy to at least one person who was there. Could be coincidence, but the overlap is worth acknowledging. By the time the Gazette article was published, there was already an entire region of the Grand Canyon carrying the names of Egyptian gods, and it was in that same region where the article placed its cave. I could be wrong, but the pattern is hard to ignore. There is a deeper question about what Dutton knew, about what John Wesley Powell found during his 1869 expedition, and about what conversations were happening in the Geological Survey that never made it into published monographs. That needs its own episode. But hold the name Powell, it comes back. I need to take you somewhere else now, and I want to do this carefully, because I am stepping into someone else's sacred tradition. The Hopi people have lived in the high desert of northern Arizona for thousands of years, not hundreds, thousands. And among their oral traditions, passed down through ceremony and firelight across more generations than written history can count, there is a story that stopped me cold. The Hopi speak of beings they call the Anu Sinom. In the Hopi language, Anu means ant. Sinom means people. Ant people. Not as metaphor, not as fable, as memory. According to Hopi tradition, during the destruction of the First World, a period of catastrophic fire, the surface of the earth became uninhabitable, and it was the ant people who came. They opened the doors to their subterranean cities. They guided the Hopi underground, into caverns of stone and silence. They provided food, they provided shelter. They taught the Hopi how to grow beans in the darkness, how to keep the sacred flame alive when the sky above was burning. It happened again when the Second World was destroyed by ice. Again, the ant people opened their doors. The legend says they gave so much food to the humans that it made their own bodies thin. That is why ants today have such narrow waists. I am not editorializing. That is the story as it has been told for generations. The Hopi still commemorate this. Each February, inside their kivas, those subterranean communal prayer chambers, they perform the bean sprouting ceremony called Poamu. The fires burn continuously, turning the chambers into hot houses. The ceremony is not symbolic. It is a reenactment, a living memorial to a time when the Anu Sinom taught humans how to grow food inside caverns. This is documented. Frank Waters published it in his Book of the Hopi in 1963. The Smithsonian itself included Hopi ceremonial photography in its annual reports from as early as 1920. Two stories, same landscape, same theme. One from a Phoenix newspaper in 1909, the other carried in oral tradition for millennia. Both describe the same thing, people living underground in Arizona. I am presenting this as a shape, not a conclusion. The evidence does not answer whether these stories are connected, but it does not dismiss it either. I would be curious to know if any of you have come across something similar, because this connection, it bothers me, in a productive way. There is a word in Sanskrit, kai, meaning anthill, va, meaning dwelling, kiva, the same word the Hopi use for their subterranean prayer chambers. That thread connects to something much larger than this episode can hold. We will come back to it. Here is where it breaks down for me. Here is where the comfortable explanations start to feel insufficient. In 1987, Congress passed Public Law 191, the National Parks Overflights Act. The law stated that noise associated with aircraft overflights at the Grand Canyon is causing a significant adverse effect on the natural quiet and experience of the park. The Federal Aviation Administration then established the Special Flight Rules Area over the Grand Canyon. The restricted airspace extends from the surface up to 14,500 feet. Within it, 5 designated flight-free zones. All aircraft operations prohibited below that ceiling. Not discouraged, prohibited by federal law. The only exceptions are law enforcement, firefighting, emergency medical evacuation, and park administration. No one else. Routes are fixed, altitudes mandated, commercial air tours capped, quarterly reporting required. One of the most regulated airspaces over a natural feature in the United States. And the official reason is noise. Maybe that explanation is sufficient. A nation protecting a natural treasure from helicopter noise. That is a legitimate reason. But the timing and scope are worth examining, because the restrictions do not merely limit noise, they limit observation, they limit access. Large portions of the inner canyon are off-limits without permits that are rarely granted. And some areas, particularly where formations carry those Egyptian names, are functionally inaccessible to the general public. I know that is a significant claim. The Federal Aviation Administration's own regulations, Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 93, Subpart U, describe these boundaries using precise latitude and longitude coordinates. These are not guidelines. They are federal law, enforceable and enforced. I am not claiming these restrictions exist because of a newspaper article from 1909. That would be a leap. And I am not in the business of leaping. I am in the business of walking, slowly, and looking down. Both things are true simultaneously. There is an article describing an underground citadel in a specific region of the Grand Canyon, and that same region is today one of the most restricted areas in the national park system. This could mean many things, but both facts exist in the same space, and the space between them has never been adequately mapped. There is a question about what changed in the 1980s that made these restrictions necessary. We will need an entire video for that. So let me hold all of this at once, because that is what this investigation demands. Not pieces, the whole shape. 1882, Dutton names Grand Canyon formations after Egyptian deities. 1902 through 1908, those names become official. 1909, a newspaper claims Egyptian artifacts were found in that same region. The Smithsonian denies involvement. The story sinks into microfilm. For nearly a century. 1987, the government imposes some of the strictest airspace restrictions in the park system over that same canyon. Meanwhile, the Hopi, who have been here for millennia, have always spoken of underground cities, of beings who sheltered humanity beneath the earth. Their sacred tradition, documented by anthropologists and published by the Smithsonian itself. I have been sitting with these questions for months, and they have not resolved. They have only deepened. Either the maps are coincidence, the article is a hoax, the restrictions are about noise, and the Hopi traditions are metaphor. That is one shape. Or some of these pieces fit together in a way the official record has never addressed. And the silence around that possibility, the archival gap, the institutional quiet, the zones you cannot enter, and the sky you cannot fly through. That silence has a shape too. I know which way I lean, but I want to hear where you land. If this feels like too much, I understand. But stay with me, because the historical record is incomplete here, and that incompleteness itself is worth studying. I want to end where I started, with a date, April 5th, 1909. A newspaper printed a story. It named names. It described locations you could plot on a map. It claimed something extraordinary had been found 2,000 feet above a river in the most famous canyon on Earth. And then, the story vanished. Not because it was disproven, not because somebody climbed to that shelf and found nothing. It simply stopped being discussed. The record went quiet, and it stayed quiet for almost a century. Maybe that is all it is, a hoax that aged well. A tall tale that found new life in a digital world hungry for mystery. Maybe, or maybe not. But I cannot stop thinking about it. If you know something I do not, the comments are where this investigation grows. I am not asking whether you agree. I am asking what connections you are seeing that I might have missed. Either the silence means nothing, or it means everything. The next video involves a name I mentioned earlier, Powell, and what his expedition recorded in 1869 that never made it into the official reports. I think I am ready now. See you there.